Good morning, Year 8. Our final lesson in our Stuart's booklet concerns the event known as the Glorious Revolution, which took place in 1688. Now, this is an incredibly important part of Britain's history, and as I go through the video, I'll be able to explain to you why. So, in 1685, Charles II dies. Now, Charles had lots and lots of children, but every single one of them was illegitimate. And this posed a big problem for the English monarchy. How are they supposed to have someone become the new monarch when Charles has no legitimate heir? Because all of the children that he had been with people he wasn't married to. But the solution seemed pretty self-evident. Charles had a brother, James II. So, upon the death of Charles, James took on the throne, and now there was a big problem with James, and the problem was this. James was a Catholic. And considering one of the issues that led to the English Civil War was Charles I's flirtation with Catholicism, having a Catholic monarch as head of both church and state in England was incredibly problematic for many of the leading nobles within the country. As a result, a mini rebellion took place led by the Duke of Monmouth. Now, the Duke of Monmouth believed that he could overthrow James and then become king himself. He raised a small army, but James went into battle against him and brutally annihilated the Duke of Monmouth's army, and James was pronounced victorious. The Duke of Monmouth himself, despite being a staunch Protestant, heavily convinced in his faith, begged for forgiveness and even offered to convert to Catholicism as a way to apologise for treason. However, James saw through this and had the Duke executed, and there he is on the far side being beheaded. Now, James's Catholicism meant that many of the anti-Catholic laws that had been in place in England up until that point were not reversed as such, but they were certainly undermined. And this posed a big problem. England had not had a Catholic monarch since Mary I, all the way back in the mid-1500s. Flash forward 130 years later, suddenly they have another Catholic monarch, and despite the fact that the majority of the population were Protestant, they were members of the Church of England, they would still be ruled over by a Catholic. To make matters worse, James married a Catholic woman, Mary of Modena. And what that meant is it locked in the Catholic succession going forward. Because when James and Mary would have a child, that child would be raised in the Catholic faith, and that child would be the legitimate heir to the throne of England. However, previously, James had been married to an Englishwoman by the name of Anne Hyde, and they'd had a couple of daughters, one of whom, Mary, was married to the Dutch Prince William of Orange. Now, for many of the leading English nobles, this solved their problem. They did not want a Catholic monarch to rule over England, and they had someone who was a legitimate heir to the throne, who was also married to another legitimate royal coming from the Dutch royal family, who was also a convinced Protestant. So what they did, they wrote a letter to James and asked him, could you invade England? You can overthrow James, and then you can become our new Protestant king and rule over England, and you would have the loyalty of the nobles because you would have that common link with religion. William assembled an army of around 40,000 men in Holland and set sail and landed off the coast of Devon in southern England. When his men came ashore, they were greeted as they marched through the country by thousands and thousands of people wishing them well, because there was an enormous anti-Catholicism within even the lower sections of English society who wanted to get rid of this Catholic king and replace him with a Protestant. James, terrified by what was going on, ended up fleeing to France, and not long afterwards William and Mary are appointed as the monarchs. Now, despite being invited over to take over the throne, there were certain conditions that they were forced to sign up to. So in 1689, they were forced to sign up to something called the Bill of Rights. And this outlined what the position of the monarch would be going forward. There had always been problems with the monarch's power, going back to Henry VIII, going back to Charles I, as to what the monarch could and could not do. And the nobles took the view that if we are starting again with a new king who's come from Holland, who has seized the throne, we need to make sure he knows what rules he has to follow. So some of the clauses included things like no Catholic would be able to sit on the English throne. This stopped any more Catholic claims to the throne from ever being taken seriously again. Secondly, members of Parliament would be free to say whatever they wanted within Parliament. This means the king could not execute them or imprison them or put them on trial for anything they said within Parliament. And that's something that still exists today. Thirdly, no taxes could be forced upon the people without the consent of Parliament. Previously you had had Charles I, who through raising ship money and other attempts to raise money without Parliament, and Parliament put a stop to that. They said no, if the king wants to raise taxes, he must get the approval of Parliament to do so. Fourthly, the king should not be allowed to have a standing army during peacetime. This is to stop what had happened during the period when Oliver Cromwell was in charge, when he used the New Model Army to mercilessly crush any resistance to his rule. And they took the view that if the king had a standing army during peacetime, he might be tempted to imprison his enemies or to go after them. So they put a stop to that. And finally, the king could not suspend any of the laws made by Parliament. The king can no longer overrule. So, despite the fact that he's still the monarch and they still believe that the monarch was chosen by God, Parliament has a far bigger say than they'd ever had done at any other time in England's history. However, despite fleeing to France, that was not the end of James. James gathered his own army and began to launch a rebellion from Ireland. Why did he launch a rebellion from Ireland? Because unlike the rest of the British Isles, Ireland had remained a bastion of Catholicism, and that's where a lot of his support came from. So in 1690, at the Battle of the Boyne, in Ireland, James and King William met on the battlefield, and King William emerges victorious. He defeats James, and it's an incredibly bloody and brutal battle. And following that, he goes into exile, never to return to England again. And he spends the rest of his life in Europe, in particular in France and in Rome. After 40 years of absolutism with Charles I, then with Oliver Cromwell, and the various issues that had occurred through England, from here on out, England begins to take on a far more stable relationship between the monarch, the people, and the lords who help to rule. An absolute monarch in the form of Henry VIII or Charles I or even Oliver Cromwell would never rule over England again, because the Bill of Rights put in place limits on the monarch's power. So, for today's lesson, what you need to do, you need to read through the Glorious Revolution lesson. You have 5 questions that you need to answer. So, thank you, Year 8.